Perhaps nowhere on earth has there ever been a group of people more versatile than the monks of Europe. They were physicians and scholars and agriculturists and inventors. And they, perhaps more than any other group, is responsible for helping to save Western civilization. Let's talk about that today on The Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome once again to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today it's the monks who helped to save Western civilization. Now there's a small publishing industry out there of books called How So-and-so Saved Civilization. This group saved it, and that group saved it. The monks deserve this title, ladies and gentlemen, the monks. Even the Irish, who are sometimes credited with saving civilization, did so in large part because of their monks. Who were these people, after all? They were monks. Well, I don't want to assume any prior knowledge. Who are the monks? What are they doing? And how did they save Western civilization? We already see in the 3rd century a tradition whereby women religious, we would call them, began to live together and share the same spiritual and prayer life and dedicated themselves to the care of the poor and the sick. So it's very easy to see in that the tradition of convents and the life of the nun. Also in the 3rd century we see a tradition among men to be hermits. The hermits were people who forsook everything, who pursued absolute solitude in order better to commune with God and to hear Him and to pray to Him. St. Anthony of the Desert in the mid-3rd century was a classic example of this. He lived to be over 100 years old, and he went out into the deserts of Egypt. The hermits typically lived completely alone. They would gather on Sundays to worship God, but otherwise they kept to themselves. And they tended small vegetable gardens to support themselves, or they made baskets, but otherwise theirs was a life of extreme solitude. Now, in a certain sense, this is all well and good, and the Church has never altogether repudiated the tradition of hermit life. In fact, she's had a pope who was a hermit in the 1290s, Pope Celestine V. But right away, there were critics of the hermit's life, because the hermit, who lived apart from anyone who could provide him spiritual guidance, sometimes engaged in spiritual practices that were, well, rather questionable. Some of them engaged in, shall we say, penances that were exaggerated, or some of them would go out of their way to wait until food rotted before they would eat it. And this type of thing would go on, and a good many Catholics began to argue that this is not a healthy thing. This is not what God intends. This is not what Christ is calling you to. For example, in the Christian East, St. Basil the Great repeatedly said that the life of the hermit is not the Christian one, ideally, because what we should be doing is living among our fellow human beings, ideally. That would be the best solution. The monks should live in solitude, but in a sense a kind of communal solitude, with other monks, with other people who have in effect retreated from the world. Now it's important to understand the monks are not saying that the world is evil, therefore we retreat from it, or that spaghetti and meatballs and an ice cream sundae are all evil, so therefore I want to deprive myself of them and eat more simply. To the contrary, because Catholics believe in the goodness of the created world, what the monks are saying is that the world is wonderful, it's a great thing, it's filled with a great many delights, and that's why it's such a sacrifice for us to give them up to show how much we love God. One of my friends has sometimes explained it this way: it's one thing to bring flowers for your wife. It's quite another to bring her flowers on a rainy, miserable day, when she knows it was just an unbelievable ordeal for you to get those flowers and get back in the car and keep the vase from spilling over in the car. I've had plenty of experience with this, folks. This is exactly why the monks made sacrifices, to show how much they loved God. In the West, it was a man named Saint Benedict who argued that we need to have monks who live in a single place, and they live together, and they have the same spiritual regimen, and they live under the authority of an abbot. St. Benedict composed something called the Rule of St. Benedict, which was in effect an outline for how a monastery should be run. He wrote this around 529, and with the passage of time, this became the model for organizing monasteries. A monastery, of course, is where the monks live. And St. Benedict argued that the monks should live penitential lives, it's true, but not lives that are so penitential that it would disrupt their spiritual lives. We don't want that. We want them to live at the material level of about the average Italian peasant. That would be acceptable. They should get adequate sleep. They shouldn't do too much physical labor. They should be moderate in all things. Physical labor and prayer and study, and nothing out of moderation. The monasteries in Ireland were quite another story. There, the model, in effect, was working 14 hours a day, doing back-breaking labor, and then coming in and praying all the psalms. And this, it seemed to St. Benedict, was just too much, that you couldn't live a healthy spiritual life if you were being that rigorous with your physical body. Now, it should be mentioned, by the way, that the Irish monasteries attracted people from all over. They couldn't house them all, so they must have been doing something right. But this was St. Benedict's model. It was flexible, and it seemed to understand human nature very well. And it turns out that St. Benedict and his monks played an essential role in saving Western civilization at a critical moment and building up important parts of it. And yet, I will never forget, in my days as a professor in New York, after telling my class all about the monks and all the things they had done, I actually had a student say to me, "That's very interesting. Are there any monks today?" Well, that's just depressing, right? That she didn't even know there were still monks today. And so of course I told her, not only are there monks, I've got 1,000,000 friends who are monks. I realize that's perhaps somewhat unusual, but I have a great many friends who are monks. And let me tell you something, living in Manhattan as I did while I was getting my doctorate, you find that just about anything can go on in Manhattan. Nobody cares. Nobody's looking at you. You can have a weird haircut. Nobody cares. You could be on fire. Nobody cares. But I had a friend of mine who was on his way to becoming a monk. He hadn't taken his vows yet, and he came and visited me in his habit. And we went out for nachos at a local place. And I'll tell you, people will look away at anything, but if you're having nachos with a monk, they cannot take their eyes off it, apparently. This is just a bizarre sight, even for Manhattan. So, unfortunately, the monks don't have the high profile they once did, but they deserve our respect. Because, after all, what did the monks accomplish? Well, for one thing, apart from just copying texts, which we all know they did that laboriously, but they also did a lot of physical labor. For example, they cleared and reclaimed all kinds of land in Western Europe. Because what often happened is that people wanted to donate land to the monks as a good work. That's wonderful. Look at what I'm doing for the monks. But people would typically give the monks really crummy land. They want to help them, but they don't want to help them that much. So the monks often found themselves having to deal with land nobody really wanted. And a lot of times it was swampland. In those days, I mean, obviously a swamp has no value. It's just a source of pestilence. The monks would dike and drain the swamp and make it into fertile land. And a great many experts on the history of agriculture in Western Europe have said, for example, we owe the agricultural restoration of a great part of Europe to the monks. Another one said, wherever they came, they converted the wilderness into a cultivated country. They pursued the breeding of cattle and agriculture, labored with their own hands, drained morasses and cleared away forests. By them, Germany was rendered a fruitful country. And finally, every Benedictine monastery was an agricultural college for the whole region in which it was located. The monks introduced crops and industries and production methods that people hadn't known before. And they weren't afraid to work with their hands at a time when manual labor was looked down upon and despised. The monks were inspired to engage in physical labor because they knew, for one thing, that when you engage in hard physical labor, this can be a great form of penance and an opportunity for the mortification of the flesh. So sure, they were thrilled to work with the swamp that nobody else wanted to do. So at a time when you were despised for doing physical labor, the monks, in effect, made it something honorable. At a time when agriculture was collapsing, the monks' labor helped to bring it back. The monks were involved in rearing cattle and horses, brewing beer, raising bees and fruit. And all over Europe, they introduced essential aspects of local economies. For example, in Sweden, it was the corn trade that owed its existence to the monks. In Parma, cheese making. In Ireland, salmon fisheries. And in a great many places, the finest vineyards. The monks were also intensely practical in that they stored up the waters from springs in order so that they could distribute them if a drought ever struck. In Lombardy, the peasants learned irrigation from the monks. The monks have also been credited with being the first to work toward improving breeds of cattle instead of just leaving the process to chance. So there's agricultural labor from the monks at a critical time in European history. With the Roman Empire collapsed, the monks show up and do all this critical work. Beyond that, the monks pioneered in machinery and mechanization. The ancient world of Greece and Rome was not particularly heavily mechanized, but Europe of the Middle Ages changed all that. Particularly the Cistercians, which are a reform-minded group of monks from the late 11th century, they built water-powered factories at hundreds of their 742 monasteries around by the 12th century. They used water power for all kinds of purposes, for crushing wheat and fulling cloth and tanning. Far more mechanized were they than anything that had ever been seen in Europe up to that time. They were also great metallurgists. They used the slag from their furnaces as fertilizer. So they were constantly thinking of practical things they could do for the life of Europe. And they instructed Europeans as to how they themselves could do these things. They were also technologically advanced in practical things like clocks. The first clock we have any record of was built by the future Pope Sylvester II in 996, but much more sophisticated clocks were built in the 14th century. But it's not just clocks, and it's not just agriculture. It's charity and education and inventiveness. All these things we're going to look at as soon as we come back from the break. So join me after the break, and let's talk more about these monks. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're talking about the monks today and their unsung heroism in helping to build and even save Western civilization at critical moments. Let me give you a little quotation from a French scholar writing about the achievements of the monks, because this sums it up in terms of their practical contributions. He writes, in effect, whether it be the mining of salt, lead, iron, alum, or gypsum, or metallurgy, or quarrying marble, running cutlers' shops and glassworks, or forging metal plates, also known as firebacks, there was no activity at all in which the monks did not display creativity and a fertile spirit of research. Utilizing their labor force, they instructed it and trained it to perfection. Monastic know-how would spread throughout Europe. In fact, even today, we're still only beginning to appreciate fully the extent of monastic technological cleverness. In the late 1990s, an archaeometallurgist at the University of Bradford named Jerry McDonnell found evidence in North Yorkshire, England, of a degree of technological sophistication that pointed ahead to the great machines of the 18th century Industrial Revolution. He found that the monks had built a furnace to extract iron from ore. Now, in the 16th century, which is when the period that that MacDonald is looking at, 16th century England, the typical one of these furnaces in the 16th century had not advanced very far over its ancient counterpart. It was very inefficient. The slag, or another word for the byproduct of these primitive furnaces, had a very substantial concentration of iron in it, because they couldn't get to high enough temperatures to get all the iron out of the ore. So the leftover still had a lot of iron in it. But MacDonald found that when he was investigating, that in fact the monks in England had in fact built a furnace where the slag was low in iron content. They were somehow able to get to high enough temperatures to get more and more of the iron out of it, very similar to a modern blast furnace today. So MacDonald says the monks were on the verge of building dedicated furnaces for the large-scale production of cast iron. This is the key ingredient, perhaps, that ushered in the industrial age. And he says that the furnace that he investigated in England was a prototype of such a furnace. Now, what ended up happening to that? Why didn't they develop all these big furnaces? Why do we just see this one prototype? Well, remember, this is the 16th century in England. What's King Henry VIII up to? Well, he's closing down monasteries and confiscating their property so as to reward his well-connected friends. And so Henry VIII helped to destroy this outstanding example of creativity on the part of the monks. Thank you very much, Henry VIII. We'll have time to talk about you in a future episode. But we also now have charitable work. Now, charitable work we're going to spend a whole episode on, but I want to at least pause and say something about the monks' specific contributions to charity. The rule of St. Benedict called for the monastery to dispense alms and hospitality to whatever extent its means permitted. Specifically, it instructed monasteries that all guests who come shall be received as though they were Christ. Now, the monasteries served as free inns where foreign travelers and pilgrims and the poor could find a safe resting place. I love this quotation from an old historian of the Norman Abbey of Bec. He said, "Let them ask Spaniards or Burgundians or any foreigners whatever how they have been received at Bec. They will answer that the door of the monastery is always open to all and that its bread is free to the whole world." In some cases, the monks were even known to make efforts to track down poor souls who, being lost or alone after dark, found themselves in need of emergency shelter. They established contrivances for warning sailors of perilous obstacles. Or, in fact, nearby monasteries often made provision for shipwrecked men in need of lodging. All these were typical contributions of the monks. They also built up the medieval infrastructure and built and repaired roads and bridges. But as part of their charitable work, they were also great physicians for their day. In fact, it was the church that helped to create the hospital in the first place. But the monks went even further, because there weren't hospitals everywhere. But there were a lot of monasteries. And initially, the monks provided medical care to their fellow monks. But as time went on, they realized that they possessed a critical skill that local townspeople also needed. So oftentimes they would go out into the local towns and seek out sick people who were in need of their medical care. Again, I would say that's a fairly unsung aspect of the monastic contribution. But in addition to being great physicians and agriculturists and inventors, they were also great educators. St. John Chrysostom tells us that it was already in his day, around the 4th century, it was already customary for people in Antioch to send their sons to be educated by the monks. St. Boniface established a school in every monastery he founded in Germany. In England, St. Augustine, and here we're talking not about St. Augustine of Hippo, but St. Augustine of Canterbury. St. Augustine and his monks set up schools wherever they went. St. Patrick is given credit for encouraging Irish scholarship. And of course, the Irish monasteries developed into very important centers of learning, and they dispensed instruction to monks and laymen alike. Now, sometimes it's been said that the monks did engage in some education, but they were really only educating their fellow monks. Well, that's, as we've seen, not entirely true. There are plenty of cases we have on record of the monks. There are plenty of cases we have on record of the monks providing education to people in the local area. But let us say that that accusation is true. Let's even grant it for the sake of argument. Let's say that the monastery's contribution had simply been to teach other monks how to read and write. That's all it was. Well, even if that had been their only contribution, that would have been no small accomplishment. Because consider what happened in the Greek Dark Ages. Now, people have typically forgotten about this, but it's very important. From about 1100 to 800 BC, we had something called the Greek Dark Ages. And what happened here was that the Mycenaean Greeks had some kind of terrible disaster befall them. The nature of that disaster is still debated. But something terrible happened to these people. And when the smoke had cleared, for the next 300 years, we find that, in effect, the ancient Greeks, the Mycenaean Greeks, had lost literacy. They had lost the ability to read and write. Now you wonder, how could you lose the ability to read and write? How could you forget that? Well, partly it happened because people were scattered following whatever disaster it was that befell them. And they had to think solely of their own survival. And learning how to read and write was not exactly critical when you just needed food and sustenance. Secondly, it's been speculated that maybe whatever disaster struck the Mycenaean Greeks struck in particular the educated classes, so that those who would have remembered literacy were in fact wiped out. Well, whatever the explanation, the fact is they lost literacy at a time of general civilizational collapse. Well, let's remember that the monks were functioning and carrying out all these wonderful tasks I've described at a time in Western European history that was very similar. There was general collapse. There was political disorder. There was an abandonment of education by and large. There was an abandonment of urban life. That was the environment in which the monks functioned. And so even if all they had done was to keep literacy alive, well, that's very important, because that means they prevented a repeat of the Greek Dark Ages when literacy was lost. Thanks to the monasteries, literacy was not lost, but Western Europe managed to hang on to it. That's no small contribution, is it? In fact, the contributions of the monks have been so great that even scholars who are inclined to be unsympathetic to them have conceded it. And I've always tried to go out of my way when I've written about Catholic history to cite not only non-Catholics, but anti-Catholics when possible, so that people won't come back and say that I'm just picking and choosing among my sources. When people who don't even like the Catholic Church are saying, okay, the monks did a lot, that says something. So, for example, one unsympathetic scholar said, the monks not only established the schools and were the schoolmasters in them, but also laid the foundations for the universities. They were the thinkers and philosophers of the day and shaped the political and religious thought. To them, both collectively and individually, was due the continuity of thought and civilization of the ancient world with the later Middle Ages and with the modern period. That's no small compliment. A century ago, another historian said, it was the monks, and they alone, who carried to a successful issue the tremendous undertaking of mollifying the rampant invader, softening the rudeness of his manners and the harshness of his spirit, familiarizing him with the restraints of Christian morality, and bringing home to him with convincing power the necessity of observing the fundamental principles of law and order, instructing him in the use of arts and instruments of industry and social progress, in a word, of assimilating, civilizing, and Christianizing 20-odd barbarian tribes, many of which, by the way, were very impressed with the morality and the conviction of the monks. They were very moved by their witness. A Protestant historian says, had it not been for the monks and monasteries, the barbarian deluge might have swept away utterly the traces of Roman civilization. The monk was the pioneer of civilization and Christianity in England, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, Sweden, Denmark. With the incessant din of arms around him, it was the monk in his cloister, for instance on Mount Athos, who by preserving and transcribing ancient manuscripts, both Christian and pagan, as well as by recording his observations of contemporaneous events, was handing down the torch of knowledge unquenched to future generations and hoarding up stores of erudition for the researches of a more enlightened age. The first musicians, painters, farmers, statesmen in Europe, after the downfall of imperial Rome, under the onslaught of the barbarians, were monks. Now these are critics of the monks. You can only imagine what their friends have to say. These are their critics. Here is the monastic contribution. And you'll notice that in this brief overview, I've not even mentioned, or at least hardly so, the contributions they made to the literature of the Western world by preserving ancient classics and indeed the Bible itself through laborious copying. Because that is the one thing that's conceded to us. The monks did this. But what I want to show you is they did so much else in so many areas, one can hardly even believe it. Now today we touched briefly on the subject of charity, because we saw the monks as great dispensers of charity. Guests are to be treated as if they were Christ himself. Well, that is a small part of the story of Catholic charity, which will occupy us next time. Catholic charity is one of these areas in which people will concede the Catholic Church has done wonderful things. But what I want to suggest to you is that even we Catholics don't realize just how great Catholic charity is. It's a far more extraordinary story than even we believe. So join me next time on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. See you then.